Hi, I am Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Sorry if Loki is still in frame. He likes to sit on my lap a lot. So today I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read in May of 2022. I did not get as much reading done this month as I was hoping, especially since my TBR for June is going to be 18 books originally, now it's gone up to 22, so we'll see how my reading does because I only read 12 books last month. But I wanted to quickly wrap up all the books that I read for the 2 readathons I loosely participated in last month in May, and then I'm going to wrap up all the other books I read. So I did a mid-month wrap-up. I will link that down in the description if you're curious for more details into like the first half of the month of books. So the 2 readathons I participated in was May of the Moderns, and then I also participated in the Asian readathon. First, I'm going to start with the May of the Moderns. I was hoping to read more, but I only read 3, and all of them I've actually talked about in my mid-month wrap-up, and so I didn't read any more since then. So I read The Hollow by Agatha Christie. It's a Poirot mystery. I believe it's number 27. It was very good. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. The next one, that officially most of these stories came out in the 20s to 30s. A few of them were published after her death, so after the 50s, but most of these technically count because all of them were written before the 50s and in that like half century. So oh, I forgot to mention what the May of the Moderns readathon was. Basically, it was to read books between the year of 1900 to 1950. So these 3 count. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I gave this 5 stars. Some of the stories I enjoyed more than others, but I enjoyed them all. The final one I read was Why Didn't They Ask Evans, also by Agatha Christie. This book I really enjoyed. It is a standalone, and I remember seeing the Marple version of it from BBC Marple, and I enjoyed it so much better having it just from Frankie and Bobby's perspective as opposed to Miss Marple kind of in the background always. Yeah, I just liked 2 amateur detectives solving a case. It was very good. I talked about it more in my mid-month wrap-up. Now we get to the second readathon I did, which is the Asian readathon. And again, I only read technically 3 books. You could do 4 depending on if you count non-Asian authors that write about Asian history. So technically I'm going to count 4, but I don't know if it actually counts. You're making so much noise. If you hear like little jingling, it's because like he's constantly making noise. Case in point. I started off with The Scholar and the Serving Maid. I talked about this in my mid-month wrap-up, but it is a Qing Dynasty drama that, because it was a court case that was in the 1800s, and Feng Ai just kind of put together the story in like a story play form, and it's been performed and turned into TV shows. It was bonkers, but it was a lot of fun. The next one I read by an Asian author, and I didn't put that on my Asian readathon TBR, but it was Homicide in Hollow Hollow. This is the second book of Tita Rosie's Kitchen Mysteries, and it's by a Filipino author. This specific entry in the series centers around this beauty pageant. Someone is murdered, and Leela is involved and has to solve it. I didn't like this as much as the first book. It's still not bad. I give it 3 out of 5 stars, and I think I gave the first book 4 out of 5 stars. So it was still good. Also, I put a chair next to me now so he can sit next to me up. So if the chair is here and you see any tails, I'm sorry, he's around. But this one was good. It was fun. I'm just not a big fan of like beauty pageants, and they did try to make it like, oh, beauty pageants aren't that great, and let's make this beauty pageant like better than previous years. But it was still a beauty pageant, and I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of like the ethical nature of beauty pageants. I could go into a rabbit hole with that, but basically, yeah, not a huge fan. But the mystery was still fun, and I still enjoyed the story and the characters. The next one was the one that I don't know if this counts for an Asian readathon because it is by a white author, but it's Jade Dragon Mountain by Elsa Hart. I've talked about this a bit before, but basically Li Du is this librarian of the Forbidden City in China, originally in the 18th century, but he was friends with people that turned out to be traitors to the Emperor of China, and because of that, he wasn't executed because he wasn't directly involved in plotting against the Emperor, but he was exiled from the Forbidden City. And so he's been traveling around on the outskirts of China since then. He comes to this city where his cousin is the magistrate. And the city is near the border between Tibet and China, but it's on the Chinese side. While he is there, he meets this Jesuit monk, and the Jesuit monk is mysteriously poisoned, so Li Du kind of has to solve the case, while his cousin, the magistrate, is kind of trying to hush it under the rug because he doesn't want his reputation to be harmed, especially since the emperor is going to be arriving soon, because there's going to be like a eclipse, which is a big deal because the emperor can say, oh, I have this power to control the sun vanishing. And we all know, obviously, that it's not his power, it's just nature's power. But the emperor is going to use the Jesuits' understanding of stars and astrology to use for his own benefit and basically to show his power. So that's going on too. There's a lot to love in this book. It is a highly historical work, even though it is a mystery as well, and there's the tropes and elements of a murder mystery. You have clues, you have suspects, everyone has a motive. So there's a lot of the regular mystery stuff, but the depth of how this world is captured is really interesting because yes, I know a lot about Chinese history, but to see a lot of the references, especially if you are a fan of Asian history, like you can enjoy this book without knowing anything about Asian history, but I love like the random references to like ancient classics and to like historical figures and to myths and stories. There's also this friend, Hamba, that Li Du meets, who is basically a storyteller. And so throughout the book and throughout the sequel, I didn't finish the sequel. I did now as of when you're watching this, but unfortunately I didn't by the end of the month. So I will be wrapping up the second and the third book next month. But basically, Hamza, that's his name. And like Hamza is a fascinating character in general. His story changes every time he tells of his origin and his upbringing. The story changes. So even though this is a murder mystery, there's so much more depth to it than a regular murder mystery. So I'm counting it as Asian Readathon, even though it's not actually by an Asian author. And the last book I read for the Asian Readathon is Nanjing Requiem by Ha Jin. Oh, this will probably be an unpopular opinion, but I didn't like this book. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. So this book centers around the rape of Nanking, also known as the Nanjing or Nanking Massacre. Basically, it was during World War II, 1937, when Japan invaded China. And during that time, they took over Nanjing, but they didn't just do that. For, I believe, 6 weeks. I can't remember if it's 6 or 10 weeks. They massacred Nanjing, raped hundreds, brutally murdered. They went over the top. They didn't just like shoot people, kill them. No, they tortured them horrifically. This was a horrific massacre of the Nanjing people. And there is a great book, The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. I recommend you reading that because I think it's the best book that kind of describes what happened, and it is such a thoroughly researched book as well. It's a great, exceptional book. But this one is a fictionalized version of that happening. Here's my problem with it. I had like a couple problems with it. First of all, it's fiction. Here's the thing. Here's the big difference I find, and tell me if I'm wrong, the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And it's not simply that like it's obviously fiction, it's obviously nonfiction. Nonfiction for me tends to be more distanced. You are told about these people, but you don't necessarily like walk in their shoes. But it's not quite the same as seeing into their thoughts because you can't quite know it. Like, yes, they can quote letters and things like that. And what I really love about fiction is you can really get into a character's head. However, this book feels very distant. All the characters are distant. The protagonist is this middle-aged Chinese woman who works for Minnie, I can't remember her name, but Minnie was the head of this Jinling College in Nanjing. She was the president of that. So you have a perspective very close to this president and seeing and experience Nanjing, but having that sense of protection because it is part of like the foreign district. So a lot of the characters are protected from the Japanese. And because of that, this sounds weird, but the characters feel like they are in a very privileged situation. Like it never feels like they themselves are in danger. And I feel like that makes the horrible things that happen in Nanjing not as traumatic because yeah, maybe they're seeing it, but they're not really like part of it. And so for me, like the entire narrative of what happened in Nanjing, the horrible things that the Japanese did, it's not really captured well in this book. Also, there are just so many characters that like, yeah, maybe you meet them in one page and like 50 pages or 100 pages later, they are brutally killed by the Japanese, but you didn't really know them, you didn't really care about them, and all the main characters remain safe throughout the book. So I was kind of disappointed with. Okay, now let's get to the other books that I read this month. 2 I already have went into in my previous wrap-up. In fact, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco I did a full review of, so I'm not going to talk anything about it. Medieval murder mystery, focused on philosophy and theology. Really good book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Prayer for Beginners by Peter Kraft. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Oh, I forgot to mention I also read Book Lovers by Emily Henry, which I was not a big fan of, and I talked about more in my wrap-up. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. So the first one is The Sinner and the Saint, Dostoevsky and the Gentleman Murderer Who Inspired a Masterpiece by Kevin Birmingham. I enjoyed this book so much. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars was just because I kind of felt like this was a misnomer, the title. Basically, the story follows mostly Dostoevsky and his upbringing. Fyodor Dostoevsky was a Russian author who lived from the early 19th century, nearer to the late 19th century. A lot of his masterpieces were published, were published in the 1850s to 1870s about. Oh my gosh, this video, I'm so sorry, like for all the noises he's making. He's chasing his tail right now. You don't really focus on Lassonard, it's French, the murderer who inspired Dostoevsky to craft Raskolnikov, the murderer within Crime and Punishment. Very little time in the book is actually spent on the murderer himself, and most of it's spent on Dostoevsky, which is not really a criticism because obviously I love learning about Dostoevsky, and in fact by the end, because the book kind of stops after Dostoevsky publishes Crime and Punishment, and I was like, wait, I want to know more about his life. I want the entire story of his life. So I obviously need to find like another biography and just read more about Dostoevsky's life because he's such a fascinating individual and he made so many like stupid mistakes in his life. But I think this book was more about Dostoevsky than the murderer and trying to understand why Crime and Punishment was made and how it was constructed, both from focusing on understanding Dostoevsky himself and of course the murderer who inspired him to craft it, but also from the perspective of like what was going on in Russia during that time, what affected Russian politics and social changes. And there was a lot of social changes going on because, you know, you still had serfs in Russia, and then there was an abolishment of serfdom during Dostoevsky's life, right before he published Crime and Punishment. So there's a lot of like nuance in understanding how Crime and Punishment was crafted. So I guess this book is more of understanding Crime and Punishment and the world in which it was written and published. So yeah, exceptional book. Not exactly what I was expecting, especially from the title, but it was a great book. But final book, which I finished, I think the last day of the month, and I'm so glad. I have been wanting to read this book for years, and I finally got around to reading it. And that is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I mean, since I read The Sinner and the Saint, I had to read an actual Fyodor Dostoevsky book. And this book was amazing. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So it is quite different than I was expecting. So I've never seen a movie of it. I kind of basically, the only thing I knew going into this book, that it was a drama centering around several brothers. Obviously, in the title. But it was a lot different than I thought. The first half of the book is much more centering around understanding who these brothers are. You have the father. You have a son, Dmitry, Mitya. Mitya is the oldest brother, and he is from the father's, who I would just call Karamazov, Mr. Karamazov, his first wife. And then you have Ivan and Ilyosha, whose Alyosha's full name is Alexei, I believe, but everyone just calls him Alyosha. So I'm just going to refer to their names. So many names. Each character has like 3 names, and it's hard to keep track of, but I'm definitely used to that in Russian novels. So hey. But basically, the first half of the novel is getting to know these 3 brothers. There's also a Smerdakov, and he is the son of this woman who their father had an affair with. So technically he's the illegitimate son of Mr. Karamazov. So you have 4 sons technically, but 3 are legitimate. 1 is more in the background. And interestingly enough, because I read The Sinner and the Saint, and in The Sinner and the Saint, it talks about how Fyodor Dostoevsky suffered from seizures. And it's funny because Smerdakov, the illegitimate son of Karamazov, he actually has seizures, and it is a big plot point, which is really interesting to see like how Dostoevsky weaved his own experiences into his own books. So I really enjoyed that. So the first half of the book is getting to know these characters, and then the second half gets into a murder mystery. I don't want to like give away spoilers, but someone is murdered. And there is a question of, he just loves to climb in the back of chairs. I swear, he's such a weirdo. There's a question of who was the murderer, and there's a whole court case. Like, it turns into a court procedural at the end. It's just so strange. So in that sense, like, it is quite different than Crime and Punishment. Because even though it does deal with crime and it deals with human evil, it's also, I'm so sorry, he's just going to be distracting in the entire video. But it's also kind of, it's weird because like the mystery itself is quite opposite to the one in Crime and Punishment. Because in Crime and Punishment, we're introduced to Raskolnikov, he does the murder, it's super graphic. In this one, it's much more of like, we don't know who did it. And it's much more about all these characters. Now, Ilyosha is like the saint of the book. Like, he is just too good for this world, I swear. Whereas Mitya, the oldest brother, he's very impetuous and passionate and ridiculous. And the youngest, the middle brother, Ivan, is much more, he's very much like a socialist. Which is interesting because Dostoevsky also dabbled in understanding socialism, which was also talked about in The Sinner and the Saint. So I was so glad that I read this book right before I read this book, because it felt so much more meaningful reading it. But Ivan is very much above religion, above modern, above like traditional hierarchy. He's very much a revolutionary in many sense. So you have these 3 brothers, the 3 main characters, I would say, who are so vastly different and very well developed. So yeah, I could gush about this book. I'm not sure if I like this better than Crime and Punishment. I think there's definitely more interest in this one. Like, if you're deciding whether to read this one or Crime and Punishment, I might recommend this one more, just because I think it would be more interesting to people, because there's a lot here that is interesting. Because, you know, you have romance, you have murder, you have drama, you have all these 3 brothers being very interesting, and all these other characters we meet being very interesting. And yes, Crime and Punishment has that, but I feel like Dostoevsky's writing was so much more polished in this one because Crime and Punishment was, in a sense, his first masterpiece, and this one was written after it. And you can see how his writing is more polished than it was in Crime and Punishment. And a lot of his thoughts and themes are more thoroughly examined here. So even though I personally think I like the Crime and Punishment better, just from personal taste, I think this is an objectively better book. So yeah, controversial opinions here. So those are all the books that I read in May of 2022. So have you read any of these books? I am currently 4 days into June, and I have been reading. In order to get all my reading done for this month, I have to read 300 pages a day. So I've just been nonstop reading for the past 4 days. So that's been fun. But luckily I got my baby with me, and he just sits and naps with me. It's very cute. It's very cute. So have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, subscribe. I post every Saturday and Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.